And it's also interesting in the fact that the first book we have lined up for this book review is, in fact, a fiction book. Now, some people may be jumping up and saying, yo, why review a fiction book? You're supposed to be an Islamic podcast. Well, if it hasn't been made clear already that just because we're an Islamic podcast, Botswana's first Muslim podcast, doesn't mean that we have to be very verbose, devoid of fun, and coming here with that, yes, this is halal and this is haram, and you should sit down and listen to me. No. We're trying to make this dynamic. We're trying to make this fun. And me being one of the hosts and me being one of the creative minds behind the scholar and the student, I think it goes without saying that my brain is not wired like anyone else's, so I have to inject my personality into it if I'm going to have this podcast be anything different from whatever else is being put out there already. So when it comes to fiction is very important, I'll have you know. I mean, it is part of our culture, it's part of our heritage, it's part of the legacy that we're leaving behind for the next generation. And there are so many benefits of reading fiction. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I will have to spend a little bit of time actually enumerating these benefits because this is the first book review. So in order for us not to have to repeat ourselves every time we review a fiction book or any other book for that matter as to why reading fiction is important, I think it's best we have this out of the way right here, right now. And I'd also like to shout out to Thomas Frank and Martin Bamey from the College Info Geek podcast. I was listening to them earlier on today. It was the episode, I think it was recorded about 2 years ago. It was the episode about them and their top 5 books. So Thomas's top 5 books, fiction, and Martin's top 5 books. So going off on that also gives me a bit of a concept as to what I should say for this very first book review podcast. So shout out to those guys. I don't know if you guys are watching, but if you did, it'll mean a real lot to me because you're literally my favorite podcast. Shout out to you guys as well. So the importance of reading fiction, first and foremost, it does make you happier. All right. I don't think I need to explain that you're de-stressing, you're taking a break from work. If you're someone like me, whose university degree, whose education hinges upon reading so many books and so many pages in a day, at the end, you get kind of tired of reading about cases and judges and academics and their takes on why this should be legalized and why this is incorrect legal analysis. At the end of the day, you just want to sit back and relax. So in that context, why not have a little bit of fiction to actually de-stress you? And if you take into consideration motivation and productivity, like what use is all that motivation and productivity if you're just going to be a slave to the machine? You have to take out time for yourself to refresh and come out bigger and better. And it may sound antithetical. It may sound like I'm contradicting myself over here when I say that rest and taking a break is actually productive in of itself. And if you don't believe me, you can go and check out the millions and millions of productivity resources out there that openly tell you, and this should be common sense, but as humans we're forgetful, so let's just remind each other, we're not robots. We cannot function at the same level of efficiency throughout the same day, throughout the same week, and throughout the same month, throughout the same year, throughout our lives. There will be peaks and there will be highs and lows and all these things that you have because we are human. We have limitations, and the best thing we can do in light of our productivity is to be aware of those limitations, to take ownership of those limitations, and to work around those limitations. One of them being rest, and fiction provides an ample source of rest. That being said, when you experience a story in fiction, it allows you to experience a story vicariously. And this is something I'm taking directly off of the College Info Geek podcast. So what does it mean to experience a story vicariously? This is a term that we use in the legal realm as well. Vicarious means that you are experiencing it or the effects of a certain event that we're talking about. In this particular instance, we're talking about reading fiction. So you are experiencing the same experiences of the characters, although it's not happening to you directly. So you may be reading a war story. You yourself are not taking part in the war, but because of the way it's described, you too can empathize with the character, and you too can go through the same sorts of emotions, or at least a fraction of what is being described over there. These are some of the experiences that you can take on without actually putting yourself in those shoes. And the thing about reading fiction is that if you're reading, especially if you're reading it from a book, as in you're not listening to it in my preferred way, which is an audiobook. I'll come back to that later. If you're reading it from an actual book, be it paperback or ebook, then when you actually read, your mind is actually simulating this, and you're playing a video in your own mind, and you yourself are the director and you're setting the scene, and this allows you to even go deeper into the experience. And of course, I'm sure that the audiobook version that I so love would allow me to do the same thing. It's just it's recited aloud as opposed to making your own brain do the reading, which I don't really have a problem with. But I guess we could have a different session on to why I prefer audiobooks, whatever the case may be, or maybe I'll just touch upon that as time goes on. And the thing about fiction also as well is that it does give you a better memory. As a law student, I always have an exam coming up, and even as of this recording, I've got an exam coming up in a few weeks. It's property law. So someone might object that you should be studying cases about the Law of Property Act 1925 and how it applies to registered and unregistered land. Well, okay, fair point. But one thing that you must understand about reading fiction is that when you actually memorize aspects of the story, whether it be plot points or names of the characters or the characters' motivations, the names of certain abilities that they have, when you remember, when you engage in this act of memorizing, what it does is that it actually creates space in your brain to memorize even more. So when I go and memorize the plot points and what have you of the story that we're reading, then it makes it easier for me when it comes time to memorize the cases and the judge's decisions and all the academic reports and journal reports and everything that I have to remember for my property law exam. I hope that makes it crystal clear. So when you engage in the act of memorizing, then memorizing actually becomes easier in other aspects. I'm not saying that you have to apply yourself to memorizing every single book that you read, but of course you will remember at least the story in a very general manner. You have to, I guess, pick up the points. Unless you find it a very boring story, then of course you would forget it sooner rather than later. But the point was that fiction does increase your memory. And of course, this should be a no-brainer. It allows you to pick up vocabulary, which you can then use to enhance the conversations that you have and even enhance the type of writing that you do. Some of you may be in school doing your IGs or BGs or JCs, whatever the case may be. Some people may even be listening and they study English at university. I envy you because I really wanted to do that. I might end up doing that eventually, but for right now, I'm just soldiering on through the LLB. And anyway, coming back to the point. So the thing about fiction is that the dialogue that you find is, generally speaking, more relevant to an actual conversation, or it's similar to an actual conversation that you have in real life, as opposed to a productivity book or a book on psychology. Not to cut those off completely, because I do love reading those types of books as well. But the point I was making is that when you see how certain words are used in actual everyday conversation, then that should usually motivate you to use those same words in the conversation yourself, and that makes you a more articulate speaker. It makes you a better writer. And for those of you who know me from my old days, you know that I myself am something of a writer, and of course that means I consume a lot of fiction regardless of whatever type it may be, because a good writer is a good reader, and I believe Stephen King did say something along that line. And speaking of Stephen King, I'd like to send a shout out to my old English teacher, Mr. Christopher Smith. Smithy, you rock, man.